The lights dim. The crowd roars. A single spotlight cuts through the darkness, landing on a figure whose presence alone can silence an arena. For a moment, time seems to stop, and in that breathless pause, history prepares to unfold. On the stage of the 2003 BET Awards, two giants stand on the edge of a moment the world will never forget. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss another untold story. The 2003 BET Awards was more than just another night of music, glamour, and celebration. It became a living, breathing testament to legacy, a bridge between generations, a sacred exchange between legends. That night, Michael Jackson, the king of pop himself, walked onto the stage to present James Brown, the Godfather of Soul, with the Lifetime Achievement Award. What followed was not simply an award presentation, but a moment so powerful, so emotionally charged, that it etched itself into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. This was not a scripted segment. It was not just a ceremonial gesture. It was history speaking to itself, greatness honoring greatness, and the world watching in stunned silence. Michael Jackson had not been on a stage like this in a long time. His public appearances had grown rare, his presence almost mythic. When his name was announced, a ripple of shock moved through the audience. Whispers turned into gasps. Gasps exploded into screams. People stood. Some clutched their chests. Others wiped tears before a single word was spoken. It felt as though the very air in the room had changed. Michael Jackson emerged, radiant yet humble, dressed in his signature elegance, a quiet confidence wrapped in a soft glow. The camera cut to James Brown, seated in the audience, eyes wide, lips parted, visibly overwhelmed. The man who had shaped rhythm, funk, soul, and performance itself was suddenly a fan again, a student watching his greatest admirer approach the stage. Michael Jackson began to speak, and his voice carried a reverence that silenced the room. He did not speak as a superstar addressing another icon. He spoke as a son speaking to a father, as a student honoring a teacher, as a soul standing before the man who gave him the language of movement, rhythm, and performance. He called James Brown his greatest inspiration. He spoke of watching him as a child, studying his every move, memorizing every step, every spin, every drop to the knees, every scream that pierced the soul. He spoke of how James Brown didn't just sing, he commanded. He didn't just perform, he transformed stages into sanctuaries of rhythm and fire. And as Michael Jackson spoke, the audience began to understand. This was not about fame. This was about lineage. Long before Michael Jackson moonwalked across the world, James Brown had already rewritten the rules of performance. His energy was explosive. His shows were athletic. His presence was magnetic. He didn't just entertain, he electrified. In the 1960s and 70s, when the world was shifting, when voices demanded change, James Brown became more than a musician. He became a movement. Songs like Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud were not just music, they were declarations. His rhythm became resistance. His voice became empowerment. Michael Jackson, growing up in Gary, Indiana, absorbed all of it. The screams, the spins, the footwork, the raw emotion. He studied James Brown like scripture. And now, decades later, here he was, standing before his hero, presenting him with the ultimate recognition of a lifetime's impact. As Michael Jackson continued speaking, his words grew more personal, more vulnerable. He spoke of how James Brown taught him that performance was not just about sound, but about feeling, that every movement should mean something, that every note should carry emotion, that greatness required sacrifice, discipline, and devotion. The camera captured James Brown's face, and it told its own story. The man who had conquered stages across the globe was now visibly emotional. His eyes shimmered. His jaw trembled. His hands clasped tightly together, as if holding back a wave too powerful to release. Then came the moment. Michael Jackson turned, lifted the award, and invited James Brown to the stage. The audience rose as one. The applause was thunderous, unrelenting, almost spiritual. James Brown stood slowly, deliberately, as though each step toward the stage carried the weight of decades. When he reached Michael Jackson, something extraordinary happened. They embraced. It was not a brief hug. It was not a polite gesture. It was a full, heartfelt embrace, two legends holding each other, sharing not just respect but love. The crowd erupted. Tears flowed freely in the audience, on stage, across living rooms around the world. For a moment, words disappeared. Only feeling remained. James Brown took the microphone, and his voice, though weathered by time, carried an unmistakable fire. He thanked Michael Jackson not just for the award, but for carrying the torch. He spoke of how proud he was to see the next generation take the flame and light the world with it. He acknowledged that what Michael Jackson had done with music, dance, and culture was not just success. It was transcendence. Then something unexpected happened. James Brown, the Godfather of Soul, the architect of funk, the man who invented modern stage performance, turned to Michael Jackson and challenged him. "Can you dance?" The crowd exploded. It was playful, it was spontaneous, it was electric. Michael Jackson smiled, that iconic, knowing smile, the kind that hinted something extraordinary was about to happen. And then, without warning, the stage transformed. James Brown began to move, his feet tapping out the rhythm of decades, his shoulders bouncing with the familiar groove that had defined generations. The crowd screamed. Cameras flashed. The atmosphere shifted from reverence to eruption. Then Michael Jackson joined in. What followed was not a dance battle. It was a conversation, a dialogue of rhythm, motion, and spirit. James Brown led with his signature footwork, his fast shuffles, his powerful spins. Michael Jackson responded with fluidity, grace, precision, and innovation, moonwalking, spinning, sliding across the stage like liquid light. It was past meeting future, foundation meeting evolution, the source meeting the reflection. The audience was no longer seated. They were standing, shouting, crying, witnessing a once-in-a-lifetime exchange. The energy was volcanic. The stage seemed too small to contain what was happening. And then, the moment that stunned the world. James Brown, the Godfather of Soul, stepped back, pointed at Michael Jackson and bowed. Yes, James Brown bowed to Michael Jackson. Time froze. The crowd erupted into chaos. Screams turned into roars. Tears turned into sobs. The symbolism was unmistakable, the origin acknowledging the successor. The master recognizing the student who had become a master himself. Michael Jackson looked shocked. He reached out, pulled James Brown back up, and bowed in return. Two kings, two eras, one moment. That single gesture became one of the most powerful images in music history. But beneath the spectacle, beneath the applause, beneath the viral moment, there was something deeper, something more human. Michael Jackson was not simply honoring James Brown. He was honoring his roots. He was acknowledging that his greatness did not emerge in isolation. It was built upon the shoulders of those who came before him. And in doing so, he reminded the world that true greatness is not about standing alone at the top. It is about lifting others up, recognizing the lineage, and paying tribute to those who paved the way. This moment did not happen by accident. In the years leading up to the 2003 BET Awards, Michael Jackson had faced intense scrutiny, controversy, and personal challenges. His relationship with the public had grown complicated. His genius had never faded, but his vulnerability had become more visible than ever. And yet, when he stepped onto that stage, none of that mattered. What mattered was love. What mattered was gratitude. What mattered was respect. This was Michael Jackson in his purest form, not as a headline, not as a controversy, not as a mystery, but as an artist honoring his hero. Behind the scenes, insiders later revealed that Michael Jackson had insisted on personally presenting the award. This was not a request from producers. This was his decision. He wanted to be the one to say thank you. He wanted to be the one to stand face to face with the man who shaped his destiny. And James Brown, too, had not expected this. He had assumed the award would be presented by someone else, a host, an executive, a celebrity. When he saw Michael Jackson walk onto that stage, he was genuinely shocked. The emotion on his face was real. The tears were real. The bow was real. There was no script for that. There was no rehearsal for that. That was history unfolding in real time. The moment resonated far beyond that night. It echoed through music culture, through documentaries, through tributes, through generations of artists who saw in that exchange a blueprint for respect. It became a lesson in humility, that no matter how high you rise, you never forget who lifted you. And for Michael Jackson, that moment became one of the last truly public, universally celebrated appearances of his career. It was a reminder of who he was at his core, a child prodigy who became a global phenomenon, yet never lost his reverence for the artists who inspired him. Years later, after Michael Jackson's passing, that moment took on even greater weight. People revisited the footage, not just as entertainment, but as testimony. They saw a man who, despite the pressures of fame, despite the storms surrounding his life, still carried gratitude in his heart. They saw a man who knew that his story was not his alone. It was part of a greater story, a larger rhythm, a longer song. James Brown would later speak about that night with deep emotion. He called it one of the proudest moments of his life, not because of the award itself, but because of who gave it to him. Because in that moment, he saw his legacy not as something that ended with him, but as something that continued, something alive, something evolving. The exchange between Michael Jackson and James Brown was not just symbolic, it was generational. It was cultural. It was spiritual. It was the sound of the past shaking hands with the future. It was the heartbeat of music recognizing itself. And that is why, decades later, people still talk about that night, still replay that clip, still feel that emotion, still remember where they were when they saw it, still feel chills when James Brown bows, still feel tears when Michael Jackson pulls him back up. Because moments like that do not belong to one era, they belong to history. They belong to humanity. They belong to everyone who has ever loved music. The 2003 BET Awards did not just honor a lifetime achievement, it witnessed a lifetime connection. Michael Jackson did not just present an award, he presented a legacy. And James Brown did not just accept an honor, he passed a torch. As the lights faded that night, as the applause echoed through the auditorium, as the cameras cut to commercial, something invisible yet powerful lingered in the air. A sense that the world had just witnessed something rare, something pure, something eternal. Because true greatness is not measured in records sold or awards won. It is measured in how deeply you touch others and how deeply others touch you. And in that moment on that stage, Michael Jackson and James Brown touched the soul of the world. And yet, that moment was only the beginning of the story. Because what unfolded on that stage at the 2003 BET Awards was not simply a beautiful exchange between two legends. It was the visible peak of a relationship that stretched across decades, generations, and the very DNA of modern music itself. To truly understand why that moment carried such weight, we must rewind the clock, far before the lights, the applause, and the standing ovation, to a small boy with an enormous dream. Long before the world knew the name Michael Jackson, there was a child standing inches from a flickering television screen, eyes wide, heart racing, completely entranced by the figure dancing across the screen. That figure was James Brown. The boy was Michael. In the living room of his family home in Gary, Indiana, Michael would watch James Brown's performances with almost religious intensity. His siblings remembered how he would mimic the moves, rewind the tapes, replay the steps, and practice for hours. He wasn't just watching, He was studying. He wasn't just copying, he was absorbing. James Brown's footwork, fast, sharp, explosive, became a language Michael learned fluently. The spins, the drops, the slides, the dramatic pauses, the way James Brown commanded a stage as if the entire universe existed solely within the spotlight. These were not tricks to Michael, they were tools of expression. They were emotional weapons. They were the grammar of performance. And something deeper happened in those moments. Michael didn't just learn how to move. He learned how to feel on stage. He learned that music was not simply sound, it was storytelling. That performance was not simply entertainment, it was communication. That an artist's job was not just to be heard, but to be felt. James Brown unknowingly became Michael Jackson's first teacher in the art of command. By the time Michael stepped onto the world stage with the Jackson 5, the influence was already there, subtle, yet undeniable. The way he hit certain beats, the way he punctuated movements with sudden stillness, the way he let silence speak as loudly as sound. These were all echoes of James Brown, transformed, refined, and reimagined through the lens of a new generation. But something else was happening too. Michael Jackson was not simply becoming another performer, he was becoming a phenomenon. As the years passed, Michael's star rose beyond imagination. He broke records, he shattered expectations, he transcended genres, borders, cultures, and languages. He became not just an artist but a global symbol, a living icon. And yet, through it all, one thing remained constant: his reverence for James Brown. In interviews, Michael spoke openly about his admiration. He called James Brown the greatest entertainer who ever lived. He credited him with teaching him discipline, stage presence, and respect for the craft. He often said, "I wouldn't be here without James Brown." That moment became a message to young artists, a message to future performers, a message to the world. It said, honor those who came before you. It said, greatness is inherited through respect. It said, the past is not something to escape, it is something to embrace. It said, legacy is not something you own, it is something you carry. And Michael Jackson carried it with grace. In the years following the 2003 BET Awards, Michael Jackson's life would continue to unfold in complex, painful, and deeply human ways. He would face challenges that tested his spirit. He would retreat further from the public eye. He would remain a figure of fascination, debate, and devotion. And ultimately, in 2009, the world would lose him suddenly, shockingly, devastatingly. When Michael Jackson passed, the footage of that night took on a new meaning. People watched it not just as a moment of celebration, but as a moment of farewell. They saw in his eyes a tenderness that felt like a goodbye. They saw in his voice a softness that felt like closure. They saw in his bow a humility that felt like legacy. And they saw in James Brown's bow a prophecy. Because what James Brown bowed to that night was not just Michael Jackson the man, it was Michael Jackson the future. And that future continues to shape music, dance, fashion, culture, and identity to this day. But the story does not end there. Because the true impact of that moment extends beyond those two men, beyond that stage, beyond that night. It lives in every artist who dares to move differently. It lives in every dancer who feels rhythm in their bones. It lives in every singer who pours emotion into every note. It lives in every performer who understands that art is not about perfection, it is about connection. And that connection was on full display that night. Let us return once more to the stage. The lights, the applause, the embrace, the bow, the dance, the tears, the silence, the thunder, the heartbeat, all of it. Because what the world witnessed was not just a performance, it was a passage from one era to another, a passage from one soul to another, a passage from one generation to the next. And Michael Jackson stood at the center of that passage, not as a gatekeeper, not as a conqueror, but as a bridge. A bridge between the roots of soul and the future of pop. A bridge between rhythm and spectacle. A bridge between history and destiny. And James Brown, standing on that bridge, looked at Michael Jackson and saw his legacy walking toward the future. That is why he bowed. Not because he was stepping aside, but because he was stepping forward together. Two men, two legends, one rhythm, one heartbeat, one story. And that story continues. Because as long as music exists, as long as rhythm moves the body, as long as performance touches the soul, the exchange between Michael Jackson and James Brown will live on, not as a clip, not as a memory, but as a lesson. A lesson that says, greatness is not inherited by birth, it is inherited by gratitude. A lesson that says, the future honors the past and the past blesses the future. A lesson that says, art is eternal but legacy is human. And in that moment, at the 2003 BET Awards, Michael Jackson and James Brown reminded the world what humanity in art looks like. Not competition, not ego, not dominance, but respect, love, recognition, and reverence. And that, more than any award, more than any performance, more than any record, is what makes legends eternal. But even that is not the end of the story. Because when two legends meet on one stage, they do not merely exchange words, gestures, or dances, they exchange energy. And that energy does not vanish when the lights go out. It travels, it echoes, it lingers, it reshapes the future in ways no one can fully predict. To understand the true depth of that moment between Michael Jackson and James Brown, we must step outside the stage and into the ripple effect it created, not just in music, but in culture, identity, and the very idea of what it means to honor those who came before you. In the days following the 2003 BET Awards, conversations erupted across the world. Radio hosts replayed the clip again and again. News outlets called it one of the most iconic moments in award show history. Musicians spoke about it in interviews. Dancers analyzed every step. Fans shared it with tears in their eyes. But what moved people most was not just the dance. It was the bow. That bow became a symbol, a living metaphor for humility and greatness. In a world obsessed with competition, domination, and supremacy, James Brown's bow to Michael Jackson felt radical. It felt almost rebellious. It challenged the narrative that legacy must be guarded, protected, hoarded. Instead, it offered a different truth, that legacy is meant to be shared, passed, and multiplied. James Brown did not bow because he was surrendering power. He bowed because he recognized power. And Michael Jackson, in returning that bow, reminded the world that true power does not rise by stepping on others. It rises by lifting others up. This exchange reshaped how many artists saw their place in the world. Young performers watching that moment realized something profound. Success does not mean erasing the past. It means honoring it. It means acknowledging that every step forward stands on the foundation laid by those who came before. And Michael Jackson embodied that philosophy not just in words, but in action. Throughout his career, Michael consistently paid tribute to his influences. He spoke openly about James Brown, Jackie Wilson, Sammy Davis Jr., Fred Astaire, and many others. He studied their performances. He learned their techniques. He absorbed their discipline. And then he transformed those lessons into something entirely new, something uniquely his own. This is what made Michael Jackson different. He did not imitate. He evolved. He did not copy. He transcended. And yet, he never forgot where he came from. That humility, that gratitude, that reverence, they were not accessories to his greatness. They were the foundation of it. The 2003 BET Awards moment made that foundation visible. It pulled back the curtain on the heart of Michael Jackson, not the superstar, not the icon, not the myth, but the artist, the student, the admirer, the human being. And the world saw him, not through headlines, not through rumors, not through speculation, but through respect. And that respect was reciprocated. James Brown, who had lived a life of triumphs and trials, victories and struggles, understood something deeply personal about Michael Jackson. He saw not just the performer, but the burden, the weight of fame, the loneliness of being watched by the world, the pressure of being perfect, the cost of being extraordinary. And in that bow, James Brown was not just honoring Michael's talent, he was honoring his endurance. He was honoring his survival. He was honoring his humanity. Because behind every legend is a human being. And behind every human being is a story. Michael Jackson's story was one of unimaginable success, but also unimaginable isolation. From the moment he stepped onto a stage as a child, his life belonged to the public. His childhood was not spent in playgrounds, but in rehearsal rooms. His adolescence was not shaped by school dances, but by studio sessions. His adulthood was not defined by privacy, but by scrutiny. And yet through all of that, he remained a student of art. He remained curious. He remained reverent. He remained grateful. That gratitude shone through on that stage. It shone through in his voice. It shone through in his posture. It shone through in his eyes. And when he pulled James Brown back up from that bow, it was not just a gesture of politeness. It was a declaration. A declaration that no one stands alone. A declaration that no one is above anyone else. A declaration that greatness is not hierarchical, it is relational. This is the deeper truth of that moment. Not that Michael Jackson and James Brown danced together. Not that they bowed to each other, but that they recognized each other as equals, not in style, not in era, not in sound, but in spirit. They recognized that they were part of the same river, flowing from the past into the future, carrying rhythm, emotion, struggle, joy, pain, and triumph along the way. And that river continues to flow. It flows through artists who were children when they saw that moment on television. It flows through dancers who learned their first steps by studying Michael Jackson, who learned their roots by studying James Brown. It flows through singers who strive not just to sound good, but to feel true. It flows through producers who sample James Brown's rhythms and build worlds around Michael Jackson's melodies. It flows through generations who may not know the full story, but feel its impact in their bones. And that is the power of legacy. Not that it stays frozen in time, but that it moves. It moves through people. It moves through culture. It moves through history. And the moment at the 2003 BET Awards became a catalyst for that movement. But there is another layer to this story, one that lives not in the public eye, but in the private spaces between these two men. Because their relationship was not limited to that stage. Michael Jackson and James Brown had crossed paths before. They had shared conversations. They had exchanged respect. They had acknowledged each other in interviews and performances. There was a mutual understanding between them, an unspoken bond rooted in rhythm, discipline, and devotion to the craft. James Brown had watched Michael grow from a prodigy into a phenomenon. He had seen him redefine performance, break barriers, and reshape the global music landscape. And Michael had watched James Brown not just as a performer, but as a pioneer, a man who carved space for Black artists in an industry that often denied them power, control, and recognition. James Brown fought for artistic ownership. He fought for creative control. He fought for respect. And Michael Jackson continued that fight on a global scale. He negotiated ownership of his masters. He fought for creative independence. He fought for artistic freedom. In many ways, Michael Jackson did not just inherit James Brown's performance style. He inherited his spirit of resistance, his refusal to be limited, his refusal to be silenced, his refusal to be defined by others. And that spirit is what made both men larger than life. But that spirit came at a cost. James Brown faced struggles with the law, with relationships, with finances, with inner demons. Michael Jackson faced struggles with the media, with trust, with health, with isolation. Both men lived under intense pressure. Both men carried the weight of expectations. Both men paid a price for their greatness. And yet on that stage, none of that mattered. What mattered was love. What mattered was respect. What mattered was recognition. And in that recognition, there was healing. Healing for James Brown, who saw his legacy alive and thriving. Healing for Michael Jackson, who felt seen, understood, and honored by the man who shaped him. Healing for the audience, who witnessed a moment of unity in a world often divided. Healing for music, which was reminded of its roots, its purpose, and its power. And that healing extended beyond that night. It extended into conversations about mentorship, lineage, and gratitude. It extended into documentaries, retrospectives, and tributes. It extended into classrooms, rehearsal studios, dance floors, and recording booths. It extended into the hearts of people who saw not just a performance, but a philosophy. A philosophy that says, you do not rise by forgetting the past, you rise by carrying it forward. Michael Jackson carried it forward. James Brown blessed that journey. And the world witnessed it. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of that moment was not what happened on stage, but what happened inside the hearts of those watching. For some, it was nostalgia, a reminder of the music that shaped their youth. For others, it was revelation, an introduction to a lineage they had not fully understood. For many, it was inspiration, a call to honor their influences, their mentors, their teachers, their roots. And for some, it was validation, proof that humility and greatness are not opposites, but partners. That night, the stage became a mirror reflecting the best of what art can be. Not competition, not ego, not spectacle for its own sake, but connection, community, continuity. And that mirror continues to reflect. Every time the clip is replayed, every time the story is told, every time the moment is remembered. And now, as you read these words, you become part of that continuity. You become part of that story. Because stories like this do not live in archives, they live in people. They live in memory. They live in emotion. They live in inspiration. They live in action. They live in the way we treat others. They live in the way we honor those who came before us. They live in the way we carry forward what we inherit. And that is the true legacy of Michael Jackson and James Brown. Not just the music, not just the dance, not just the awards, but the values of respect, the values of gratitude, the values of humility, the values of excellence, the values of love. Those values were on full display on that stage in 2003. And they remain relevant today. In a world that often celebrates dominance over dignity, spectacle over substance, fame over integrity, that moment stands as a reminder that true greatness is not loud. It is deep. It is not aggressive, it is generous. It is not isolated, it is connected. It is not temporary, it is timeless. And Michael Jackson understood that. He understood that his name, his fame, his power, they were not ends in themselves. They were tools to honor, uplift, inspire, and connect. That is why he chose to present that award. That is why he spoke from the heart. That is why he danced with his hero. That is why he bowed. That is why he pulled James Brown back up. Because he understood that the highest position is not above others, it is beside them. And James Brown understood that too. Which is why he bowed. Not in defeat, not in surrender, but in celebration, in recognition, in unity. Two legends, one stage, one story. And that story continues, not just in music, but in every act of respect, every gesture of gratitude, every moment of humility. Because legacy is not something you leave behind, it is something you live. And on that night, Michael Jackson and James Brown lived it. If this story has moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the power of respect and legacy, please subscribe, like, and share, so these timeless moments of greatness can continue to touch hearts around the world.